Recently, the whole idea of Austrian economics has had a surge in being a familiar idea. It's not quite a household term, but it's much closer to one than it's ever been. If you look at the search history of Austrian economics, it really surged, especially with the financial collapse of 2008. And of course, this is an interesting thing because for years, and certainly many people who are much older than I recognize this to be the case for decades, when people hear of the Austrian school, they probably thought, you know, what's that? I mean, that sounds pretty strange. How could there be a school of economics associated with this one country? You know, they probably thought when you would say Austrian school, they probably thought about something like Arnold Schwarzenegger teaching a bunch of kids. But in fact, this is not the Austrian school right here. I don't even know if he was playing an Austrian in the movie. The Austrian School of Economics, of course, is associated with Mises and Hayek. Not Selma and the cartoon mice. Mises and Hayek, probably two of the most famous figures in the Austrian school. There's a lot to cover because I want to give a very brief history of the Austrian school, touch on their main contributions, explain the whole of economic science and the praxeological basis of human action, and we have a little less than an hour. So let's do it. We could break down the major principles of the Austrian school as follows. This was not my breakdown, so I don't take any blame if it's wrong. I just copied it from a book. The six being methodological individualism, which is that only individuals act, not groups. Methodological subjectivism, which is that we each come at things from our own point of view. Taste and preferences, everything is determined by subjective preferences and what people as individuals prefer. Opportunity costs, any action or anything that you embark upon happens at the expense of something else. The opportunity cost of being here at this talk is whatever you'd be doing if you weren't at this talk. Marginalism, which is a major part of my talk today, the idea that things have marginal value as you move along. And I'll explain that more. It'd be getting ahead of myself a bit to try to go into that right now. And also time structure of production and consumption. The Austrians have a very important theory about how production occurs over time. This illuminates their very significant theory of the trade cycle, which Fred Foldbury is going to explain tomorrow. So I'm not going to really touch on it much, but I will discuss a few of the issues involved. Now, real briefly, the Austrian school was born in Austria in the late 19th century, particularly Vienna. In fact, for some it was referred to as the Vienna School. A few things to note about this historical context. There was a huge boom in Vienna. I think in the 19th century it was a seven-fold increase. The December Constitution of 1867 was very liberal in the classic sense in some key ways: freedom of speech, freedom of religion and press, and so forth. There was a huge boom from 1867 to 73. 1,000 new companies, dozens of banks, financial institutions, huge projects, something we can relate to in the last decade or the decade before. And then there was a huge bust. All these unfinished projects, hundreds of institutions, financial institutions, many of these banks crashed. This coincided in the late part of the century with a huge expansion of government. To give an idea, in Vienna itself, from the bust of 73 to the end of the century, the municipal public service force increased from 2,000 to 30,000. So not a minor increase in government, but a pretty major increase. Now, meanwhile, the economists in Austria tended to have a distinct context in which they learned economics, in which they studied. Most of them had to go through law just as a matter of their curriculum. They were used to studying legal principles. This put them in distinction with the German school, the German historical school at the time, which was more empirical, tended to study history, tended to look at things as facts that you can, nail down. Oh, this guy did that, therefore this is how we should think of economics. The economists thought of things more in terms of first principles. The founder of the Austrian school, it would be fair to say, is Karl Marx, who is also a pretty awesome dude in his own right. Menger he believed that he had his famous book, Principles of Economics, which he began, I don't know where he began working on it. I'm pretty sure it came out in '71. He explained that everything that happens because of individuals choosing to do things or doing things upon their own deliberation, where they're making choices. He had a little bit of experience looking at stock reports and grappling with these changing prices, and he had a lot to think about why, how do we explain these prices? And he was, he also was key in theorizing about the origin of money. We heard Greg talk a lot about money and its importance and what makes good money. In particular, Menger believed that money originated naturally in human society when, instead of barter, people start accumulating and trading items that are tradable, that are marketable. Instead of just, I'm going to try to get as many clams because they're delicious, I'm going to get clams because other people think they're delicious, and I'll be able to trade them down the line. Of course, this is how cigarettes become money in prison. This is how, when sometimes if kids get together and go Halloween trick-or-treating, and they all come back, and there's one candy that becomes really common, you might see the kids starting to trade the candy for candy that they don't really want to eat right away, but that they think they'll be able to trade. So money is a natural thing. You can't get rid of it. Pol Pot tried. It was a big disaster. The Halloween point, by the way, is Jeff Tucker's great insight. Now, he also grappled with something that was confusing economists for a long time, the so-called diamond water paradox. Now, pretty much everyone here, I would think, though, as someone who likes the Austrians, I can't know this for sure, but I would like to think, I would bet good money that anyone here would prefer a cup of finely cut diamonds to a cup of water. Am I wrong right now? Okay. Now, on the other hand, if you're in the desert and you're dying of thirst, you'd probably need the water, because we need water to live. I mean, even putting aside the desert question, you need water to live. You don't need diamonds, unless you're like, Zsa Zsa Gabor, which is a really outdated cultural reference even for my age. But you do need water. You don't need diamonds. Why are diamonds worth more, except sometimes when water's worth more? Now, by the 19th century, there was this idea of subjective value. You see, a lot of free market types, most people who care about economics say that Adam Smith started it all. And Adam Smith deserves major props because his ideas helped bring down mercantilism and a great evil. And yet, according to some of the Austrian theorists, including Rothbard, who I'm going to get to in a bit, Adam Smith kind of was a little bit backwards. Because Smith, yeah, I know, sacrilege, right? This is a controversial point, but just bear with me. Smith believed that value was based on something like labor. That to figure out why is this worth this, well, this is because this chair is worth a lot because this dude, built the chair, and that's where the value comes from. Marx took the labor theory of value, and ran with it, and created all kinds of mayhem. And people say, a lot of lefties and a lot of commies say, well, Smith, your guy says the same thing. And there's some truth to this. Even before Smith, though, there were economists of the scholastic tradition in Italy and Spain, and in particular the French Turgot, who thought that, no, value is mostly subjective. The chair's worth something because you want the chair. If I spent all day writing a crappy novel, that doesn't mean the novel's worth a lot because I spent a lot of time on it. Labor doesn't make value itself. What makes value is people wanting it. And there were already people in the 19th century, to say nothing of before Smith, who kind of thought this stuff about subjective theory in deciding value. But the problem was there wasn't quite the philosophical or institutional setting. It wasn't really in vogue to go all the way with this. People would talk about subjective value, but they still thought that individuals were part of a collective, that it wasn't individual valuation that determined everything. It was something kind of, it was kind of half-assed, whereas Menger, he went further. And in particular, and this is the most important thing ever, he realized that value isn't just subjective, it's marginal. What this means is very important. If you have 200 bushels of wheat, the first bit you got to eat, and you got to eat, feed your family, you got to eat, otherwise you're dead. And then you might use the second part to plant more wheat. If you've got extra wheat, you might make beer, you might feed the cattle, you might feed your pets. But the most important wheat is that first wheat. As you get more and more of something, each unit, and unit is kind of a difficult term to define, but each unit as is serviceable to your wants becomes worth less than the unit before. I think that, if there's a kid and it's like the first dollar he ever earned, that's a big deal. If Bill Gates earned $1, it'd be a waste of his time to even tell him, That dollar is, for him, now I can't know how he thinks of it, but we could probably assume that, if you're a billionaire, each additional dollar is almost nothing, if not nothing completely. And in fact, as time has gone on, people think, well, there's a psychological element to this because, the more you have and there is a psychological element, but the hardcore marginalists say it's not just psychological. This is just a fact of life, that the more of something you have, the less you value the next unit. And it's a fact of life beyond psychology because the more of something you have, the more the total value is. And yet the first units you get, you use for the things you most need. So this isn't just, psychological. This cuts deeper. And this, of course, explains the diamond water paradox. You want that glass of water because you're dying of thirst. But, maybe if you give a guy a glass of water in the desert and then offer him diamonds or water, he'd start to think of the diamonds, right? Now, Menger was not the last Austrian, otherwise this talk would be over. There were a few other very important people in the early days. Böhm-Bawerk was important in his discussion of interest and its relation to time. He made some advancements in capital theory. He critiqued all of the other interest theories of his time. He'd had this huge work where he just said, that guy's wrong because he's full of it, this guy's wrong because he doesn't understand stuff. I'm going to get into some of these ideas later, I'm going to kind of sum them up and say they're all thanks to Mises, even though they're not. But he did some important work, and price theory too. And then there was Friedrich von Weisser, who came up with what's been called the imputation theory, which is the theory that, the higher order goods which are goods used early in the process of production rather than consumer goods, the higher order goods, their value is determined ultimately by the consumer good. That if I have a tractor, how much that tractor is going to cost is based on what I can do with the tractor, which is based on what I could sell, the wheat for, and the bread, the cost of the bread, the cost of the sandwich, the cost of the, it gets complicated, but the basic idea is that sandwich determines the cost of the tractor. And when I first heard this, I thought, yeah, but isn't the tractor also determined by, how much it costs to build the tractor? Well, yeah, but no one would build the tractor if you couldn't sell the sandwich. He also launched the calculation debate. He came up with this idea that there's something about the market and prices that allow people to figure out what to do, what to produce, what to sell, what to stop producing, and that the problem with other systems of economics of the economy is they didn't allow this. But this gets fleshed out further down the line. Schumpeter was an important guy. He didn't coin the concept of creative destruction, but he did talk about it a lot. He was the first foreigner elected in the 1940s to the American Economic Association. And he did some important work on economic history, looking at the past Austrians. He was an important scholar in that respect. He's not the best free marketer. He advocated nationalizing coal mining. He kind of liked Hitler. So I almost thought of not including him, but I think that would be disingenuous. So now that I've, addressed the crazy uncle in the basement, this I think is our guy. This is the dude. Now, there are Austrians who, they respect Mises, but they don't consider themselves Misesians because he makes a number of points they don't go all the way with, which I'm going to touch on. But in a sense, I think most post-Mises Austrians were so heavily influenced by him. And although he didn't originate all of the ideas I'm going to explain, he put them all down in such a beautiful way. And there's a sense in which no one since him and no one before him really, so this is my opinion, but it's also the opinion of a lot of other people, that this is the guy. So I'm going to talk mostly about this guy. Now, he lived in Vienna until the 30s, but he didn't like what was going on with politics. The 30s, if you were into liberty, it sucked to be in the 30s. Maybe more than now. Because you look at Russia, it's commie. You look at Italy, it's fascist. You look at Germany, it's fascist. You look at America, it's the New Deal. I mean, everywhere you looked, the old ideas of liberalism were dying. And everyone thought, every serious intellectual at the time thought you either had to be some kind of fascist or some kind of communist or socialist. And it was really bad for him, being someone who liked liberty and being of Jewish extraction, being there in Switzerland, even though Switzerland was never taken over, but being there in Europe with the Nazis, conquering and expanding, though it was uncomfortable. And it was justified for him to be uncomfortable. When the Nazis finally took over Austria, they went and ransacked his library, and they seized all his papers. His personal library was taken by the Nazis, I think the night of the invasion, and he never saw them again. He died before seeing them. Very sad. And at least one Austrian economist, Gabillon, I guess, died in a concentration camp. And many others fled because a lot of them were Jewish, a lot of them weren't, but all of them weren't really down with Nazism the way that Schumpeter was, and wasn't a good time to be an Austrian economist. Sometimes you'll hear a slur. People think, Austrian economics, is that Hitler? Well, actually, quite the reverse. This episode was documented in a very important piece of literature, this whole Nazis versus Mises thing. In a 1998 Batman comic, Batman actually, he's upset about this. He's supposed to save Mises' library. He's really mad. Once they catalog all the books and notes in von Mises' library, they'll ship everything to some storehouse to rot. I mean, and Batman, it goes on, and here's an important panel about it, where this is Robin's diary, I think. He was against socialism in all its many forms. He was an advocate of individual liberty, free speech, and free thinking. And so, should I add, was the Berlin Batman. So Batman, he's a Mises fan. Okay, and why would Batman like Mises? Because Mises was a genius. He had some key insights, just briefly. Praxeology, putting everything in economics under an a priori roof. I'll explain that. Critique of socialism. I'll get to the calculation question, but polylogism, which is what he talked about with the Marxists thought that logic was determined by your economic station, which made it impossible to refute Marx. Because you could come up with a logical argument, and Marx would say, well, of course you think that, you're a capitalist. Of course you think that, you own stock. So, taken to its extreme, as Mises showed, this means that you could say, oh, the sky is blue. No, that's not proletarian logic. On prices, in particular the price of money, he came up with a regression theorem, which is that money has a price itself compared to other goods or maybe gold. And if you go back in time, eventually the money was a commodity that was worth something in its own right. He came up with the most fundamental, in my opinion, critique of Marxism, the one that there's a lot of problems with Marxism, hundreds. But the one that just body slams socialism and just destroys the entire thing, I think Mises came up with, where you could come up with a moral argument, which I think is decisive. You could come up with other economic arguments, but Mises' calculation problem, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes, it just I think every Marxist should just be hanging his head in shame after what Mises did. Mises just beat the crap out of Marx and just walked away without even lint on his jacket. I mean, Mises, he did it. He talked about harmony and conflict of interest, how in the market our different interests are harmonized. You might want bread, I might want meat. That's okay. Whereas once the government gets involved, there's a conflict. What do you mean you want bread? I'm not paying taxes for your bread. And he was pretty hardcore in opposing almost all manners of intervention. Socialism, the third way. The previous Austrians, most of them were fairly classical liberal, at least compared to other people. But Mises was he was what Guido Holzmann, the great Mises scholar, calls the last knight of liberalism. He's like, liberalism is the way. He wrote, these are just some of his major works, he wrote some really important stuff. Most of his key insights come into play somewhere along the line in Human Action, which is his treatise from 1949. It's like 800 pages. He conceived of it in German, came here, learned how to write in English, wrote in English. It's brilliant. Everyone should eventually read it from beginning to end. And much of what I'm going to say from now on, you can find somewhere in those pages, though, again, they weren't first introduced necessarily in Human Action, nor did Mises come up with everything he wrote, but he came up with a lot. So first, praxeology. This is really what makes a Misesian, I think. And this is what irritates some people, because it just sounds too a priori. And I kind of understand at least the psychological element to that resistance to Mises's hardcore a priori theory. But this is what it's all about. he starts with this idea that human action is purposeful behavior. And in fact, the Misesians like to point out, you can't dispute this. The very effort to dispute this contradicts itself. If you say, people don't act, you could say, why did you say that? To show you you're wrong? So you had a purpose behind what you said. And much of Misesian economic theory and what he called praxeology, the study of human action, is this idea that based on fundamental a priori truths that cannot be disputed without contradicting yourself, and a degree of reflection and reasoning, we can come up with other truths. Truths that aren't obvious as much as like I exist is obvious, but are just as a priori true, because if you trace the logic, they fundamentally rest on that assumption. And based on this, he said that economics should be, and it's a science based on a priori reasoning rather than experience. If I can really show through logic that all else being equal, the minimum wage will increase unemployment, it doesn't matter what historical experience you show me. If my argument is right, it's right. That's the economic truth. You could show me your graphs. You could have Krugman come in and say, blah, 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 though, sorry to paraphrase, but it doesn't actually refute what I said, because what I said is the truth, and if you disagree, then you're just wrong. That's kind of the whole basis, although it sounds a little bit smarter if I had a German accent, was a little older. That's really what it's all about. All of these economic concepts, values, costs, prices, profits, loss, we could root these all in fundamental axioms if we study the ideas of human action. He liked to talk about time and uncertainty being very important. Everything happens in the course of time. It has to. And uncertainty is important. If you knew the future, you wouldn't act. You wouldn't have anything to choose from, because if you knew the future would be decided. And so uncertainty is a fundamental axiom of life. This is how he did things. He started with this basic premise, which is, I'm alive, I'm thinking, I'm acting, and he created a huge system of thought. It's just a beautiful thing. One of the most beautiful compositions in the history of humanity is human action and what he did. He also argued that marginal utility is a universal fact of the human condition. It's not some bourgeois thing. You could live in the Soviet Union and it would still be true. It would still be that fifth banana wouldn't be quite as good as the first banana. He points out that we need to respect the law of association, which was David Ricardo's contribution, classical economics, the idea of division of labor. By each doing our own thing, we come together and we're able to survive and thrive. He talked about how ideas determine the shape of society. The way that people think of the world has an effect. The Marxists are materialists, which means they think if you work in a factory, you're determined to think in this way and blah, 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 and we're all like cogs in a machine. Like, I've talked to Marxists at Berkeley, and it's frustrating because, you know, they'll just say, well, of course you think that because you're blah, 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 blah. Whereas Mises is like, no, ideas shape society. If everyone wants to live under freedom, we'll have freedom. Because no ruler can get up to people and just say, I'm not listening to you. And if everyone wants to live in a theocracy, we'll have a theocracy and so forth. All action is exchange. Everything you do is an exchange. The exchanges we think of in a more specific economic terms, those are particular and specific, but those are not the only kinds of exchange. Anything you do. By walking into the restroom, you're trading the opportunity not to walk into the restroom. You're trading the opportunity to sit there and continue to listen to me try to summarize Mises, for example. Preferences are ranked in ordinal numbers, not cardinal. This is very important, as is everything that I say. But more important, everything Mises said. You can't rank things according to just numbers. Like if someone says, how much, how much do you like pepperoni pizza? And you say, 7 out of 10. And someone else says, what about hot dogs? And you say, 6 out of 10. I mean, we can kind of do this just to get an idea across. It's communicative, it's artful, but it's not really precise, because what's that mean? Is this arithmetic? Is it logarithmic? What's it mean to like pizza 1 more than, it's just like, but we can do things by ordinal numbers. I do like pizza more than hot dogs. How much more? Well, you could say a lot more, a little more, but really all we know for sure is you like pizza more than hot dogs. And how do we know, how do we confirm that? Well, we offer you the hot dog and the pizza. And if you pick the pizza, we know that's first, the hot dog second. But we don't know how much more, This is very important too. Economic calculation. Everything's involved. When we're acting, we determine what we're going to do based on economizing, in a sense. Well, I want this pizza because the deliciousness of pizza is more important to me than not feeling bloated. And these are all based on subjective preferences, and there's no interpersonal utility comparisons. What this means is I can't actually say that I like pizza more than you do. Even if you don't like pizza, and I do, because I don't really know what it means. I mean, maybe when you say I don't like pizza, you mean, well, because I love everything else more. But maybe on some level you do like pizza, I can't compare my preferences to yours. I can only compare them to my own. Money is what allows for actual accounting and calculation then. Because with money, we get a universal way to account and appraise, which is different from valuing, because appraise is based on, it's the attempt to come up with an objective guess of how much other people value, as opposed to just value, which is itself subjective. Money is what allows us to calculate. I don't know who likes pizza more, but I know I'm willing to pay $7 and he's only willing to pay $3. So in that sense, I might value it more, although we don't know who values money more. But it's money that allows businesses to even operate. Without this calculation, there's no civilization. Because if we're all just running around, just trying to build what we think we want, things will fall apart, because we won't know what's needed. We won't know what's wanted. In Human Action, he talks a lot about these ideas. I'm not going to explain them as much because this is, each one of these lines represents, dozens of pages of very dense text. But he talks about, the plain state of rest, the evenly rotating economy. These don't actually exist in the economy. These are just ways that economists try to come up with economic theories. The evenly rotating economy is an economy where everything happens exactly the same over and over, and everything, there's no uncertainty. It's just, the problem with some of these is then you don't really have profit, because profit relies on uncertainty, and then you don't have an economy. So these things can exist, but they're important models. He talks about, all this stuff, processes, valuation and higher order goods, indirect exchange, the origin of money, fiduciary media. So money, there's money, and then there's money substitutes, which is like, here's a banknote, and you go to the bank, and then they'll give you your money. And then there's fiduciary media, which doesn't really connect to money. It's those banks or other institutions say, oh, well, it's like what we call money. It's not real money. And he goes on about how this creates a bunch of problems. And there'll probably be more about that in not Karl's talk, in Fred's talk. Now, the concept of time preference is very important in Austrian theory, and economics in general, but the Austrians really apply it to everything, including their very important theory of trade and capital formation and the business cycle. This is a classic thing, Lazy grasshoppers just sitting there. Actually, that grasshopper looks pretty smart. He's playing the violin. He's learning a real skill. That ant's just carrying an apple. What a stupid ant. That grasshopper will be fine, because at the end I hear they feed him anyway. But anyway, the idea is this grasshopper doesn't want to work. He just wants to play. Now, time preference is the idea that we prefer something now to later, all else being equal. And this is also something that's not just psychological. This is a fact of life. You can't dispute this unless you're stupid. Because if we didn't prefer things earlier to later, all else being equal, then we'd never act. We would just be like, well, I could get up now, but I could get up later. I could eat breakfast, but I could just as well eat breakfast later. So, I don't know, it's a wash, right? And there'd be no action, and without action, there'd be nothing. Time preference varies from person to person. This is a generalization, but people who are wise and thoughtful, one quality that people often ascribe to such a character is a lower time preference, though they don't put it that way. Oh, he's thinking ahead. He has foresight. He's putting off current pleasure for future enjoyment. And then there are people who just want it now all the time, you know? Like my dog. He's got a high time preference. And that's why it's a trick if you can get a dog to not jump at a treat for like 5 seconds. It's like, that's smart. But if you put a dog treat there, I won't eat it for at least 30 seconds. Because I'm smarter than my dog. But actually, it's not an intelligence thing. And it's not a value thing in that it's not morally better necessarily to have a high time or a low time preference. But it's just a fact that people have different time preferences. And time preference, according to the Austrians, explain interest. Especially the originary rate of interest, which is the main market rate of interest, which all other rates tend to gravitate toward because of the process of entrepreneurial arbitrage, which is if this guy's offering cheaper interest than him, then I'm going to go to him, and then, you know, then it all works out. But interest is determined by time preference. Because what it is how much do you want your $100 now? Do you want it enough to pay $105 next year? That's a kind of a high time preference. I mean, in terms of interest. It means $5 a year. If you were willing to pay $200 a year, then you'd have a really high time preference. If you need to pay a loan shark, and it's desperate, you might say, I'll give you $1,000 next year if you give me $100 right now, because otherwise I'll die. That's a very high time preference. But it's time preference that determines interest, because it's a combination of the willingness of lenders to put aside having their money now for future money, and a combination of that and how much other people, the borrowers, want money now compared to later. So the interest starts to come to the point where it's just kind of between those two amounts. Messing around with the interest rates, as Greg pointed out, is destructive. And you'll hear more about this with Fred. But basically, the idea is that number isn't just artificial, as Greg pointed out. This is a number that has a real meaning. It's a beautiful thing. It's a market-produced. It represents a harmony of interest. It's a beautiful thing, the market interest rate. And when you go in there and you just push it down, you screw everything up, because then some people are like, well, I don't want to lend money because I'm not going to get interest back. And other people are, I'm going to borrow money. And so everyone's grasping for the same money, and you get a boom and then bust, and then everything's bad. He talks about disutility and tedium, which is work. He really goes into work. You know, what is work? And it's important because he really covers more. Mises, it's great because you're like, yeah, but what about, oh. Yeah, but, oh. God, how'd you think of that? You reading my mind? But he really goes into these ideas of how when people work, they might enjoy their work. But even people who enjoy their work, it's work for a reason. They can't work forever. They get tired. He talks about all this stuff. It's really great stuff. Land value, he talks about land value also being based on lower order values, consumable goods. There were theories about how land is this magical thing, its value comes from whatever. He says, no, it's like other commodities in its essence. And he talks about how the market economy is peaceful. Now here's where the calculation problem comes in. Well, not here, but this is where in my presentation it comes in. When the state seeks to be socialist, it seeks to own everything as an ideal. Marx and Engels were clear about this. They said, I think it was Engels who said, ultimately you need to ban interpersonal exchange because that messes up socialism. Everything has to go through us. The Marx and the factory owner who sat around and dissed factory owners all day. When the state owns everything, you don't have market prices. When you don't have the market, you don't have prices. You don't have prices, you don't have calculation. You don't have calculation, you can't produce what people need. You have warehouses full of shovels that aren't needed and not enough food, you know? People starve. The whole economy tanks. There is no economy. The whole idea of economy is economizing. The whole idea of economizing is based on calculating what's needed, based on what other people want and need and are willing to forego for what they want and need. You get rid of prices, you have chaos. In fact, the Soviet Union didn't really just exist in a bubble. It looked at other people's prices, like a kid who thinks that he doesn't need to study and then he cheats off your test. He was sitting there, not he, the Soviet Union was there, looking to the West. Oh, they're pricing bananas at this much, 10 cents a banana. Okay, well, that means we need this many bananas. They're cheating. If you actually had socialism throughout the world, that wouldn't work. You can't have socialism throughout the world. And this is why the more you try it, the more everyone dies. And this whole idea, the Marxists say, or the socialists say, oh, well, real socialism wasn't really tried. Well, thank goodness, because if you actually go all the way, there is no humanity. Now, he's a little bit more intelligent and less passionate and more thoughtful in how he makes this argument. But I'm impassioned because it's brilliant. It just makes them look so stupid. I mean, here they are arguing about how, you know, the proletarian and the capitalists beat the feudalists and now it's inevitable that we'll progress. And Mises is like, he forgot one thing. Without prices, you guys are screwed. Okay, so Mises also addresses the hampered market. This was a graph someone came up with to describe the healthcare plan under Obama. I'm not really going to explain it because I don't think anyone can. This is what bureaucracy looks like. Mises really explained intervention well. When you try to hurt the market, it's no good. There's no third way, he says. Now, personally, I'm not 100% convinced of this, at least not all of its implications. But he makes a good point that it's not that there's socialism and capitalism and then there's some middle of the road thing. No, there's the market and there's the state. And the state can come in and start pushing things around, but the market's still the market and the state's still the state. And if the state supplants everything, it's socialism. And otherwise, it should be treated like robbers. I mean, we can have a free market, and then there's these robbers that come in and every once in a while steal our TV. Doesn't mean that we have a third way. It just means we have to deal with these punks who keep interfering with our market. He argues convincingly that taxes can't be neutral, that restrictions of any kind on the market reduce economic output, that price controls and unionism are all counterproductive. In the case of price controls, the price, not just of interest, but any price, that's a real number that means something. And if you try to push it below, you'll have shortages. You push it up, you'll have a glut, because I'll have all this stuff no one can afford to buy. Currency manipulation, he argues, doesn't work in the long run to help debtors or to prop up exports, because if you hurt your currency, people will want it less, and then they won't buy your stuff. In the long run, it doesn't work. And in the short run, it doesn't even work that well if other countries follow suit and manipulate their currency. And he came up with this great insight about the tendency of intervention to beget intervention. The intervention comes in and it screws things up. And then people say, well, we need government to solve this. And then more intervention and more problems. It's a cycle of violence, actually. Though, let's be neutral and call it a cycle of intervention. we have, we hear this now, the government and its Fed create this boom. Boom leads to bust. The people say we need price controls. Price controls, if you actually had serious price controls, it would lead to shortages. And then you'd have riots, and then you'd have soldiers. And then people would be fighting back, and you'd say, well, we need to take away their guns. This is an extreme version. But this happens on a smaller level all the time. He explains warfare, welfare, total war, confiscation, syndicalism, corporativism, and all of these horrible isms. So economics is not like history. It's not this just documentation of what happened. It's a theory based on human action. It's a priori true. Economic law is actually law that applies to all people at all places and all times. It sounds fanciful, doesn't it? It sounds a little bit bold. Well, you should read that book, and then you might, maybe you'll convince me I'm wrong, that I'm following this guy who's not right, but I think he's right. It's a value-free science. What he means by that is he has preferences of how society should organize. He was a classical liberal. He didn't like government. But economics itself can't tell you what to prefer. Now, if you're not a misanthrope, it should inform you. I mean, most people want most people to be well off, to have shoes, to have houses, or somewhere a roof over their head. I don't have a house. I guess most people don't need houses. But most people, should have the basics of life, and then some more, right? Everyone wants that, actually. I honestly think even Obama and Bush want that. Given that you want that, economics can tell you how to get there. But if you're a punk and you just don't want people to be happy, economics can also tell you how to ruin the economy. Everyone should learn economics, not just the economists, because they mess it all up. When your job is academics, they like to have their little monopoly. They like to be like, yeah, I'm smart because I got all these degrees. And when they're financed by the government, either directly or indirectly, they tend to have pro-government bias. Mises thought everyone should learn economics, which is why he wrote books that, that are very, very dense. But in honesty, he goes through a lot that he writes more clearly than you might think, especially because he was a German speaker originally. It's crazy. Okay, so that's enough Mises. Hazlitt was the popularizer of Misesian ideas in America. This was back when, people like Mises' ilk used to have some sort of influence in the media, though maybe this is coming back again. He wrote in the Journal, The Nation, the New York Times, and Newsweek. You ever read Newsweek now? It's like they should just replace it with like, like when you go to like a fast food place and they have those like follow Grimace through the playground type things. They should replace Newsweek with that because there'd be more insight. But back then we had this Misesian. He wrote Economics in One Lesson, which puts all of this in a book. The short book really explains Austrian ideas. And he had a point-by-point critique of Keynes in 1959 about Keynes's general theory, which is the New Bible. And he explained why it was wrong, but Hazlitt hasn't won the day. Hayek was, of course, a very important Austrian. I'm not giving him sufficient attention because he was very important, very brilliant. He was a little different, a little quirkier. He was a little broader in his interests. Well, in a sense. He wrote about law, psychology, the philosophy of science. He's more respected by the mainstream because he was a little more nuanced. He wasn't as, like Mises is like, no, you're wrong because you're a commie. Except, again, he makes that point less, he makes it compellingly. I keep making Mises sound like he's just this little kid. But that's me. I'm that guy who's like, you're a commie. But Hayek was more thoughtful. He's like, if you're a communist, you should read this. In fact, Road to Serfdom is, Road to Serfdom, one of his most popular books, is dedicated to the socialists of all parties. Mises wasn't quite that diplomatic. He argued that social democracies will tend to move toward all-out statism. He stressed this idea of spontaneous order. And when he talks about prices and socialism and calculation, instead of using quite the tact that Mises used, he argues more in terms of information. The prices send signals of information. And no one has the information to organize society. You know, there is no, things that emerge spontaneously. It's not the human planner that creates society. It's the entrepreneurs, it's everyone individually. So it's more about information. He won the Nobel Prize, though he had to split it with a socialist in 1974 on the trade cycle. And his trade cycle theory is similar to Mises's, which you'll hear more about. Kerzner, he's a very important Austrian who's still alive and who has a lot of followers who I thought I should at least mention. I don't know him that well, his work. I know that he works on the theory of the firm and very much stresses the role of the entrepreneur. But I thought I had to mention him because there's a hardcore group of people who think he doesn't get enough attention. So there he is. This guy's my favorite. You'd think Mises was, huh? Well, now you're in for about 85 slides now. This is one slide on Rothbard for now. But Rothbard's my favorite because he went a little further than Mises on economics, and also this slide so doesn't do him justice. Like this is like a slide like this reflects how productive and important he was in like a half a day. We could have a slide for every half a day of what he contributed. But he is, in many ways, the founder of modern libertarianism, or at least, if there is one founder, it's likely him. He took Austrian economics, the most individualized, as you could probably gather from what I said, strain of economic thinking in the free market tradition, and he combined it with a respect for individual anarchism from the 19th century in America. Not the anarchists who throw chairs through Starbucks windows, or the social anarchists who think anarchy means, though etymologically, if you look at the word, they have a point, that anarchy means disorder or breaking down all organizations. No, he meant market anarchy. We have markets, we have social institutions, churches, families, but no monopoly on force, no state that monopolizes violence. We don't like monopoly, we thought. So why have an organization that not just, you know, it's bad enough to have a monopoly on software. Why have a monopoly on the guys who can put you in jail? That sounds scary. More on that later. But he took that radical strain of anti-statism, that radical theory of economics, combined it with an anti-imperialism. And it sounds like combined, though it all works together. Once you see it, you're like, oh yeah, it all fits together. Of course, I'm biased because I'm a Rothbardian, but it all fits together. That he was anti-war. And for many years, the classical liberal tradition in the broad sense was mostly anti-war and mostly anti-militarist, the Founding Fathers and so forth. And I have a whole talk on war coming. But he really was pretty adamant about this. He said, if it's wrong to tax my bread 1%, it's wrong to drop a bomb on me. And therefore, all modern war has to be indicted under this radical libertarianism and natural rights philosophy. And this is, see, Mises, I think in a sense he believed in rights, but he always stressed that rights weren't his main argument. His argument was scientific. Even if you didn't believe people had rights morally, prices, you can't have socialism. You're wrong, right? But Rothbard believed that. He said, oh yeah, prices. Prices prove that socialists are full of it. But we also have rights. Whether you believe in God or not, we have natural rights as human beings. And even if socialism worked, it'd be wrong to implement. So, you know, now we've got both sides. I know Matt gave the talk on natural rights versus you. Rothbard took it on both. I mean, maybe he'd say ultimately he's a natural rights guy, but ultimately he was also an economist. So he would say, you know, even if socialism was moral, it won't work. Even if it would work, it's not moral. You guys are wrong for so many reasons. Now, today, the Austrian tradition is stronger than in years past. I mean, That's Kane, who was the world wrestling champion, I think, last year. He's actually of this tradition. I saw him give a talk where he talked about Menger and the diamond water paradox. So maybe he's trying to disprove the division of labor, because he could give this talk, but I sure couldn't wrestle or do whatever it is the pro wrestlers do. And Ron Paul, the congressman, Texas presidential candidate, yeah, very good guy, bringing classical liberalism to a new level, libertarianism. He's probably the most well-known libertarian in the world. I don't know, but he's in Congress, and he's in the head of the subcommittee on monetary affairs, which is probably the most beautiful thing, is that he gets to grill Bernanke, and he doesn't think Bernanke's job should exist. You know, usually when you go in there, they're like, hey, you want some coffee? And this guy's like, don't you think your whole job is based on a lie? I love him. But he's an Austrian, and that just shows the diversity, popular figures. But the Austrian tradition kind of died after World War II in Austria. And we had, Hazlitt's work, and we had some work in America. But then the Foundation for Economic Education took it up. Mises, Hayek, and Rothbard, writing in the US, kept the flame alive. And today, we have so many Austrians. I won't get into it, but there's actually factions and there's controversies. But I'll just be ecumenical here. I've said I'm a Mises, Rothbard type guy, but I think it's, any kind of Austrian, I prefer to the Bernanke types, the Keynesians. There's Austrians at George Mason University. There's the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama, which does a lot of great work. And in fact, there's Mises Institutes now all over the world. I think there's almost a dozen now that have just kind of taken, this was unthinkable, 50 years ago, maybe even 20 or 30 years ago, that this would be so big. In Europe, I hear it's bigger than it is here. The Independent Institute and FEED to this day and the Future of Freedom Foundation are three of the free market libertarian institutions that come to my mind that tend to be the most Austrian-oriented. None of these groups are Austrian per se, but all of these, most of the people at most of these institutions, I think, are very pro-Mises. And there's all sorts of economists. I didn't even put them all here, but Higgs, John Mackey, I think that's how you spell his name, the CEO of Whole Foods. He's a big Mises fan. I saw him talk about human action on Reason TV and how people need to understand the Austrian theory of the business cycle, and that's pretty good. And it's kind of gutsy, given I'm a big Whole Foods fan, but a lot of those Whole Foods people, I don't think they're Austrians. I don't think they understand the prices. Maybe that's why the prices at Whole Foods are ridiculous, because they don't even calculate their own, and it's effect. And I like the organic food so much that I buy it myself. But there's a lot of people, a lot of great people. Huerta de Soto, Hans Hermann Hoppe, and Holzman are probably the three biggest names in Europe and in America. These are just a small sampling. I'm going to stop on Mises' last paragraph in Human Action because it's awesome. The body of economic knowledge is an essential element in the structure of human civilization. It is the foundation upon which modern industrialism and all the moral, intellectual, technological, and therapeutical achievements of the last centuries have been built. It rests with men whether they will make the proper use of the rich treasure with which this knowledge provides them, or whether they will leave it unused. But if they fail to take the best advantage of it and disregard its teachings and warnings, they will not annul economics. They will stamp out society and the human race. Yeah, so I ruined the end, but the middle's pretty good too.